Picture this: a 66-year-old black woman, driving to pay her respects at a funeral, suddenly finds herself surrounded by 3 police cars, with officers drawing their weapons. In that moment, Stephanie Bottom, a respected librarian who had spent decades educating children and serving her community, became another statistic in America's ongoing struggle with police brutality against black women. But this isn't just another tragic headline. This is the story of a woman whose quiet strength and determination to seek justice would expose the harsh realities faced by black women across America. Women whose stories often go untold, whose pain remains invisible, whose resilience gets overlooked in conversations about police violence. Stephanie Bottom's story represents thousands of similar encounters where black women face the intersection of racism and gender discrimination at the hands of those sworn to protect and serve. Her case, captured on body camera footage, would become a powerful testament to the courage required to stand up against injustice when the odds are stacked against you. This is a story about more than one traffic stop. It's about the systematic targeting of black women, the trauma that follows, and the extraordinary strength it takes to transform pain into purpose. It's about how one librarian's fight for justice became part of a larger movement demanding that black women's lives matter too. Today, we dive deep into Stephanie's journey from that terrifying day in May 2019 to her ongoing legal battle, exploring how her experience connects to the broader struggle for racial justice, and why her story matters now more than ever. Her courage to speak out would illuminate a pattern of abuse that had remained hidden in the shadows for far too long. Stephanie Bottom built her life around service and education. As a librarian in Atlanta, she dedicated her career to fostering learning and literacy in her community, a profession that embodies patience, wisdom, and the belief that knowledge can transform lives. At 66 years old in 2019, she represented the generation of black women who had lived through the civil rights movement, witnessed the slow march toward equality, and believed in the power of education and hard work to overcome barriers. Born in an era when black women faced both racial and gender discrimination at every turn, Stephanie belonged to a generation that understood resilience wasn't just a choice, it was a survival skill. These were women who had watched Ruby Bridges walk into an all-white school, who had seen Rosa Parks refuse to give up her seat, and who had witnessed their own mothers and grandmothers navigate a world designed to diminish their humanity. Growing up in the South during the 1950s and 1960s, Stephanie would have experienced firsthand the rigid structures of segregation. She would have attended underfunded schools, drunk from colored water fountains, and learned early that her very existence was seen as a threat by some. Yet, like so many black women of her generation, she channeled these experiences into a determination to excel, to serve, and to prove through her actions that she deserved respect and dignity. The path to becoming a librarian wasn't easy for a black woman in the South. It required navigating predominantly white institutions, excelling academically despite systemic disadvantages, and persisting through countless microaggressions and overt discrimination. Libraries themselves had been battlegrounds during the civil rights era, with black Americans staging sit-ins to demand access to public facilities. When Stephanie chose this profession, she was continuing a legacy of black women who saw education as both a personal liberation and a community responsibility. Late 2010s in America painted a complex picture of racial progress and persistent inequality. While the nation had elected its first black president, the Black Lives Matter movement had emerged in response to continued police violence against black Americans. However, the stories of black women like Breonna Taylor, Atashiana Jefferson, and dozens of others remained largely invisible in mainstream discussions about police brutality. The Hashtag Zahern movement had been working tirelessly to highlight how black women experience police violence differently, often involving sexual assault, Domestic violence, calls gone wrong, or encounters that begin with minor infractions but escalate with deadly consequences. Research showed that black women were disproportionately likely to experience police misconduct, yet their stories rarely received the same attention as those of black men. In North Carolina, where Stephanie's encounter would unfold, the state had its own troubled history with racial justice. The Rowan County and Salisbury areas, where she would be stopped, had seen their share of racial tensions over the decades. Like many Southern communities, these areas were grappling with how to address historical injustices while building more equitable relationships between law enforcement and communities of color. For black women of Stephanie's generation, interactions with police carried layers of vulnerability. They faced what scholars call intersectional discrimination, experiencing bias based on both their race and gender simultaneously. Research documented how black women were more likely to experience sexual harassment during police encounters, more likely to be disbelieved when reporting crimes, and more likely to face excessive force during routine stops. The context of Stephanie's life, an educated, professional woman who had spent her career serving others, made her encounter particularly jarring. She represented the very people who were supposed to be safe from police violence according to respectability politics. Yet her experience would prove that no amount of education, professional status, or age could shield black women from the brutal realities of systemic racism. As a librarian, Stephanie understood the power of documentation and truth-telling. Libraries had long served as sanctuaries for marginalized communities, places where knowledge was preserved and shared freely. Her profession had taught her to value facts, to seek multiple sources, and to believe in justice through information and education. These values would become crucial as she faced the aftermath of her encounter with police. By 2019, Stephanie was approaching what should have been the peaceful twilight of her career, looking forward to retirement and more time with family. She had no criminal record, no history of violence, and had spent her life contributing positively to society. She embodied everything that America claimed to value: hard work, education, service to others, and quiet dignity. On a warm May morning in 2019, Stephanie Bottom began what should have been a routine drive through North Carolina to attend a funeral. At 66 years old, she was a careful driver who rarely exceeded speed limits, always wore her seatbelt, and maintained her vehicle properly. The funeral she was attending was for someone she cared about deeply, and she was dressed respectfully in dark clothing. Her mind focused on paying her respects to the deceased and comforting the grieving family. As she drove along the highway near Salisbury, North Carolina, Stephanie noticed her speedometer reading 80 miles per hour in what she believed was a 70 miles per hour zone. It was a minor infraction, the kind of mistake any driver might make, especially when preoccupied with thoughts of loss and grief. What she didn't immediately notice were the police cars that had begun following her. Not just one, but three. Separate law enforcement vehicles from both the Salisbury Police Department and the Rowan County Sheriff's Department. There were 3 police cars behind you for about 10 miles. One officer would later tell her, though Stephanie had no idea, she was being followed for such an extended distance. The failure to notice the police cars would later be characterized as failing to heed blue lights, though body camera footage would raise questions about how visible the lights actually were, and whether the prolonged pursuit was necessary for such a minor traffic violation. When the officers finally made their presence unmistakably known, Stephanie pulled over immediately, confused but cooperative. She had been taught, like so many black Americans, that compliance was the key to survival in police encounters. Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. Answer questions politely. Follow instructions exactly. These were the unwritten rules passed down through generations of black families who understood that a routine traffic stop could become a matter of life and death. But as Stephanie sat in her car, waiting for the officers to approach, something felt wrong. Instead of the typical single patrol car pulling up behind her, she found herself surrounded by multiple vehicles. When the officers approached her car, their weapons were drawn, a shocking escalation for what should have been a routine speeding ticket. The sight of those guns pointed at her sent a jolt of terror through Stephanie's body. Here was a 66-year-old woman, alone, dressed for a funeral, posing no conceivable threat to anyone, yet facing armed officers as if she were a dangerous criminal. The message was clear. In the eyes of these officers, her black skin made her a threat regardless of her age, her attire, her obvious compliance, or her lack of any threatening behavior. "What have I done wrong?" Stephanie cried out, her voice captured on the officers' body cameras. It was a question that would echo through the footage, the desperate plea of a woman who genuinely couldn't understand why she was being treated like a violent criminal. Her voice carried decades of confusion about a country that promised equality but delivered brutality. That spoke of justice but practiced discrimination. The officer's response was swift and violent. Rather than de-escalating the situation or explaining their actions, they grabbed the elderly woman by her hair, as if she were a common criminal resisting arrest. The act was both physically brutal and deeply dehumanizing, reducing a respected community member to someone whose very body could be handled roughly and without dignity. They threw her to the ground with a force that seemed incomprehensible, given her age and compliance. Stephanie hit the pavement hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The pain was immediate and severe, but the officers showed no concern for her well-being. Instead, they handcuffed her while she lay injured on the ground, crying and still asking what she had done wrong. The body camera footage would later reveal the full extent of the officer's callousness. Here was an elderly black woman, clearly in pain, clearly confused, clearly no threat to anyone, yet being treated with a level of violence typically reserved for dangerous suspects. She was crying, asking for explanations, expressing her fear. Yet the officers remained unmoved by her obvious distress. What made the incident even more egregious was what didn't happen. Stephanie was never actually arrested. After brutalizing her and leaving her with serious injuries, the officers apparently realized they had no legitimate grounds for arrest. She was eventually released, but the damage was done. Her shoulder was torn, her body was bruised, and her faith in the system she had served all her life was shattered. The entire encounter lasted only minutes, but those minutes would change Stephanie's life forever. As she sat on the ground in handcuffs, feeling the pain shoot through her shoulder and arm, she experienced what she would later describe as the terror of believing she was going to die. "I was getting ready to die," she would tell reporters. Later, "When they grabbed me and threw me to the ground, that's when the real terror struck me that I was going to die." This wasn't hyperbole or exaggeration. It was the realistic fear of a black woman who understood that police encounters could turn deadly without warning. She had seen the news stories, heard the names: Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Atashiana Jefferson. She knew that black women were not immune from police violence, and in that moment on the ground, she genuinely believed her life was in danger. The officer's lack of concern for her injuries was perhaps as shocking as the initial violence. Here was a 66-year-old woman clearly in distress, yet no one called for medical assistance. No one showed basic human compassion. No one seemed to recognize that their actions had been grossly disproportionate to any perceived offense. As Stephanie was finally allowed to get up and return to her car, she was shaking with fear and adrenaline. The funeral she had been traveling to attend now seemed secondary to the trauma she had just experienced. Her shoulder throbbed with pain that would later be diagnosed as a torn rotator cuff requiring surgery. But perhaps more damaging than the physical injury was the psychological impact. The realization that her age, her profession, her compliance, her obvious harmlessness meant nothing when filtered through the lens of racial bias. The irony was not lost on those who would later learn about the case. The officers had brutalized a woman whose life's work had been dedicated to serving and educating the very communities they were supposed to protect. Stephanie Bottom had spent decades fostering literacy, supporting children's education, and contributing positively to society. Yet she was treated like a dangerous criminal for the crime of driving slightly over the speed limit while blacked out. The immediate aftermath of the encounter left Stephanie Bottom not just physically injured, but emotionally devastated and financially strained. The torn rotator cuff in her shoulder required surgery, a complex procedure for anyone, but particularly challenging for a 66-year-old woman whose body was no longer young enough to bounce back quickly from trauma. What should have been her final years of active work as a librarian became months of painful recovery and mounting medical bills. For 8 months, Stephanie was unable to work. 8 months of lost wages, 8 months of struggling to perform basic daily activities, 8 months of being reminded every time she tried to lift her arm that police officers had brutalized her for no legitimate reason. The financial impact was devastating for someone on a librarian's salary who was nearing retirement. Medical bills piled up, and without her regular income, Stephanie faced the very real prospect of financial ruin on top of her physical and emotional trauma. But perhaps more challenging than the physical pain and financial stress was the psychological aftermath. Stephanie found herself experiencing what many police brutality survivors describe: a persistent fear of law enforcement, hypervigilance while driving, and a deep sense of vulnerability that she had never felt before. "I was shaking in fear," she would later tell reporters, describing not just the immediate aftermath of the encounter, but the lasting impact it had on her daily life. The trauma extended beyond her personal experience to affect her relationship with the very profession she had dedicated her life to serving. As a librarian, Stephanie had always believed in the power of education, the importance of knowledge, and the possibility of justice through proper channels. She had spent her career helping others navigate complex systems, find information, and solve problems through research and persistence. Now she found herself needing to apply those same skills to seek justice for herself. The decision to file a lawsuit wasn't made lightly. Like many Black Americans, Stephanie understood that challenging law enforcement meant entering a system that was often stacked against victims of police brutality. She knew that her character would be attacked, her motives questioned, and her pain minimized. She understood that the officers involved would likely have the full support of their departments and police unions, while she would have to fight for every piece of evidence and every acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Yet, Stephanie also understood something crucial. Her silence would not protect other Black women from similar experiences. Her acquiescence would not prevent future acts of police brutality. Her decision to seek justice was not just about her own healing. It was about creating a record, establishing precedent, and demanding accountability for actions that violated basic human dignity. Working with her legal team from Emancipating C, Stephanie began the painstaking process of building her case. The body camera footage became crucial evidence, providing an objective record of the officer's excessive force and her obvious compliance. Lawyer Ian Mance would later emphasize this point. Ms. Bottom was peaceful at all times, and officers knew they were dealing with an elderly woman. Our complaint alleges these officers had no reason to use any force, much less the level of force they employed. Ms. Bottom wasn't even arrested. The legal process itself became another form of trauma. Stephanie had to relive the encounter repeatedly, describing in detail the moment when officers grabbed her hair, the pain of being thrown to the ground, the terror of believing she might die. She had to submit to medical examinations that documented her injuries, participate in depositions where her account was questioned and scrutinized, and endure the slow pace of legal proceedings while her shoulder remained permanently damaged. During this period, Stephanie also had to confront the broader implications of her experience. She began researching other cases of police brutality against Black women and discovered that her experience was part of a much larger pattern. She learned about the hashtag Say Her Name movement and the dozens of Black women who had been killed or brutalized by police. She discovered that sexual assault by police officers was disturbingly common, that Black women were more likely to experience excessive force during routine encounters, and that their stories were consistently overlooked in conversations about police reform. This education was both empowering and devastating. On one hand, it helped Stephanie understand that her experience wasn't isolated or personal, it was systemic. On the other hand, it revealed the scope of the problem and the many barriers to achieving meaningful change. She learned about other elderly Black women who had been brutalized by police, about young Black girls who had been sexualized and criminalized, about Black mothers who had been killed in front of their children. The community response to Stephanie's case provided both support and additional pressure. The Salisbury chapter of the NAACP, led by President Jamal Black, issued a powerful statement calling for accountability. This week, we watched as a 2019 traffic stop video surfaced of officers from Rowan County Sheriff's Office and Salisbury Police Department using excessive force to arrest Stephanie Bottom, a 68-year-old Black librarian from Atlanta. Unprofessional conduct, inappropriate comments, and excessive force use negatively impacts police-citizen relationships. The NAACP's involvement brought additional attention to the case, but also additional scrutiny. Stephanie found herself becoming an unwilling symbol of police brutality against Black women, a role she had never sought but felt obligated to fulfill. Community members wanted her to speak at rallies, give interviews, and become an activist. While she appreciated the support, the attention also meant that her private trauma became public property. Throughout this period, Stephanie drew strength from her faith and from the relationships she had built over decades of community service. Former library patrons reached out to offer support. Colleagues and friends rallied around her. The same community she had served for so many years now served her in return, providing emotional support, financial assistance, and validation that her experience mattered. But the struggle wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger movement, demanding justice for Black women whose experiences had been marginalized and ignored for too long. A turning point in Stephanie Bottom's case came when the body camera footage was finally released to the public. Until that moment, her story existed primarily in legal documents and news reports, words on paper that could be dismissed, questioned, or ignored. But video evidence is undeniable. When the footage emerged, viewers could see for themselves the shocking disparity between the minor traffic violation and the violent police response. The video was damning in its clarity. There was Stephanie, a small elderly woman in funeral attire, clearly complying with officers' instructions. There were the officers, weapons drawn for no apparent reason, treating her as if she posed some imminent threat. Most devastatingly, there was the moment when they grabbed her by the hair and threw her to the ground, an act so clearly excessive that even police brutality defenders struggled to justify it. The footage went viral, sparking outrage across social media platforms and traditional news outlets. People who had never heard of Stephanie Bottom were suddenly sharing her story, expressing their shock and demanding answers. The visual evidence stripped away any possibility of victim blaming or alternative narratives. This wasn't a case where the facts were in dispute. The officers' own body cameras had captured their misconduct. Community activists seized on the moment to amplify their demands for police accountability. The NAACP chapter organized protests and community meetings, Using Stephanie's case as a rallying point for broader police reform, they called for the release of the full footage, transparent investigations, policy reviews, and systemic changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. The public pressure began to have an effect. Local officials who had initially remained silent were forced to respond to mounting criticism. The Salisbury Police Department issued carefully worded statements about their commitment to positive community interactions, though they stopped short of acknowledging wrongdoing in Stephanie's case. The Rowan County Sheriff's Office similarly defended their officers while promising to review the incident. For Stephanie personally, the public attention was both validating and overwhelming. On one hand, the widespread outrage confirmed what she had known all along, that her treatment had been utterly unjustifiable. Seeing thousands of people express their support and demand justice gave her strength to continue her legal fight. The validation from strangers helped counteract the gaslighting she had experienced from those who questioned her account or suggested she had somehow provoked the officer's response. However, the viral nature of her story also meant that her most traumatic moment was being viewed and shared millions of times. Every time someone watched the footage, Stephanie was essentially reliving her assault. The video that proved her case also perpetuated her trauma, forcing her to confront repeatedly. The moment when she feared for her life, the legal momentum shifted as well. What had started as a difficult uphill battle against law enforcement suddenly became a case with undeniable evidence and massive public support. The officers involved could no longer hide behind vague departmental statements or claims of following protocol. Their actions were there for all to see, captured by their own equipment. Stephanie's legal team, emboldened by the public response and the strength of the video evidence, began pushing more aggressively for both individual accountability and systemic changes. They demanded not just financial compensation for Stephanie's injuries and suffering, but policy reforms that would prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The case began attracting attention from national civil rights organizations and police reform advocates. Stephanie found herself connected to a network of other survivors and activists who understood her experience and could offer both practical support and emotional solidarity. She learned about other cases where body camera footage had been crucial in exposing police misconduct, and she began to understand her case as part of a larger movement for transparency and accountability. Perhaps most importantly, the climax of public attention created space for broader conversations about police violence against Black women. Stephanie's case became a teaching moment, helping people understand how Black women experience law enforcement differently than other groups. The intersectional nature of her experience facing bias, based on both her race and her gender, became a focal point for discussions about systemic discrimination. The breakthrough moment wasn't just about one viral video or one surge of public attention. It was about the accumulation of pressure from multiple sources, the undeniable evidence, the community organizing, the legal advocacy, and the broader national conversation about police reform. All of these elements converged to create a moment when ignoring or dismissing Stephanie's case became impossible. As the legal proceedings continued, Stephanie felt for the first time since the incident that justice might actually be possible. The same system that had brutalized her was now being forced to confront its own misconduct, captured in high definition by the very technology meant to protect officers from false accusations. The footage had turned the tables, making the invisible visible and the deniable undeniable. While Stephanie Bottom's legal case continued to wind through the courts, the impact of her courage to speak out began rippling far beyond her individual pursuit of justice. Her story became a catalyst for important conversations about police reform, particularly regarding the treatment of Black women and elderly citizens during law enforcement encounters. The medical consequences of her encounter remained severe and permanent. Even after surgery, Stephanie's shoulder never fully recovered. She lost significant range of motion in her left arm, unable to raise it above her head, a constant physical reminder of that terrifying day in May 2019. The injury affected her ability to perform basic daily tasks and marked the effective end of her library career. What should have been a peaceful transition into retirement became an abrupt and traumatic conclusion to decades of public service. The financial settlements and legal resolutions, while providing some measure of accountability, could never fully restore what Stephanie had lost. No amount of money could give her back the full use of her arm, erase the trauma she experienced, or return the sense of safety she had felt before that encounter. The permanent disability she sustained served as a daily reminder of how quickly a routine traffic stop could transform into a life-altering trauma. However, Stephanie's decision to pursue justice created impacts that extended far beyond her personal case. The body camera footage became a powerful tool for police reform advocates, used in training sessions and community education efforts to illustrate the real-world consequences of excessive force. Law enforcement agencies across the country began using her case as an example of how not to conduct traffic stops, particularly when dealing with elderly citizens and members of vulnerable communities. The Salisbury Police Department and Rowan County Sheriff's Office faced increased scrutiny and pressure to reform their policies and training procedures. Community advocacy groups used Stephanie's case to push for enhanced de-escalation training, stricter guidelines for when weapons should be drawn during routine stops, and better protocols for interacting with elderly citizens and people with medical conditions. Her story also contributed to the growing body of evidence, supporting the hashtag Say Her Name movement's work to highlight police violence against Black women. Academic researchers, policy advocates, and community organizers cited her case in reports and presentations about the intersectional nature of police brutality. Her experience helped illuminate how Black women face unique vulnerabilities during police encounters that are often overlooked. In broader discussions about law enforcement reform, the community support that rallied around Stephanie during her legal battle evolved into lasting organizing efforts. The NAACP chapter that had advocated for her case continued pushing for police accountability measures, using the momentum from her story to advance broader reform initiatives. Community members who had been mobilized by her case remained engaged in local politics and police oversight efforts. For Stephanie personally, the resolution brought a complex mix of emotions. While she achieved a measure of legal vindication and financial compensation, the victory felt bittersweet given the permanent injuries and trauma she sustained. She expressed gratitude for the community support and legal advocacy that made her case possible, while also acknowledging the ongoing challenges faced by Black women who experience police violence but lack the resources or evidence to seek justice. In interviews following her case, Stephanie emphasized that her decision to come forward wasn't primarily about personal gain. It was about preventing other elderly Black women from experiencing similar trauma. If speaking out about what happened to me can save even one other person from going through this, then it was worth it, she said. Her words reflected the perspective of someone who understood her individual experience as part of a larger pattern of systemic injustice. The lasting impact of Stephanie's case can be measured not just in legal precedents or policy changes, but in the conversations it sparked and the awareness it raised. Her story helped educate people about the realities of police brutality against Black women, the particular vulnerabilities faced by elderly citizens during law enforcement encounters, and the importance of body camera footage in documenting and addressing police misconduct. Perhaps most importantly, Stephanie Bottom's courage to seek justice despite the personal costs demonstrated that accountability is possible, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Her case proved that with sufficient evidence, community support, and legal advocacy, Even elderly black women can successfully challenge police brutality and create positive change for future generations. Stephanie Bottom's story illuminates a harsh truth about American policing, that no amount of education, professional accomplishment, or advanced age can shield black women from the brutal realities of systemic racism. Her experience forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about who is considered worthy of basic human dignity and respect in encounters with law enforcement. The intersection of racism and ageism that Stephanie experienced reflects broader patterns of dehumanization that affect black women throughout their lives. From the hypersexualization of black girls who are seen as fast rather than innocent, to the criminalization of black mothers who are viewed as threatening rather than protective, to the brutalization of black elders who are treated as dangerous rather than vulnerable. Black women face unique challenges that demand our attention and action. Stephanie's courage to speak out despite the personal costs reminds us that justice requires individual bravery and collective action. Her story became powerful, not just because of her personal resilience, but because communities rallied around her, advocates amplified her voice, and legal professionals fought for accountability. Her case demonstrates that change is possible when we refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. As we move forward, Stephanie Bottom's story should serve as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us that police brutality affects all members of the black community, regardless of age, profession, or social status. But it also inspires us to believe that speaking truth to power can create meaningful change. The fight for justice doesn't end with individual cases or isolated reforms. It requires sustained commitment to dismantling the systems and attitudes that made Stephanie's brutal treatment possible in the first place. Her story calls us to action, to support police accountability measures, to amplify the voices of black women, and to never stop demanding that all people be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Every time we share her story, we honor her courage and recommit ourselves to the ongoing struggle for justice.